Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
We're privileged to have with us for our latest constitutional conversation, Mr. Rick Atkinson. He's the #1 New York Times best-selling author of 7 previous works of history, including The Long Gray Line, the Revolution Trilogy, An Army at Dawn, The Day of Battle, and The Guns at Last Light, and The British Are Coming, the subject of today's conversation, which is the first volume of the Revolution Trilogy. He's won numerous awards, including Pulitzer Prizes for history and journalism. His latest book is the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Fate of the Day. Rick Atkinson, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff.
For joining us.
Thank you.
Let's start at the very beginning, if we can, of The British Are Coming. And it's the epigraph that you've chosen from George Washington. And I'm going to read it. "The hour is fast approaching, on which the honor and success of this army and the safety of our bleeding country depend. Remember, officers and soldiers, that you are freemen fighting for the liberties of your country." That was just prior to the disastrous Battle of Long Island. So first, a two-part question. Was George Washington a great general?
I would say no. Certainly not a great tactician. He makes a lot of mistakes. And when he takes command of the Continental Army in early July 1775, he's had 5 years of pretty intense combat experience as a militia colonel, always under superior British command in the French and Indian War. But he's been out of uniform for 16 years, and there's a lot he doesn't know. He doesn't know much about artillery, he doesn't know much about cavalry, even though Jefferson said he's the greatest horseman of his age. He knows nothing about continental logistics because he's never had to use them. So we see him at places like Long Island, the biggest battle of the Revolution in terms of the number of men involved in late August 1776. He makes serious mistakes. He doesn't read the ground properly. He basically wakes up and the enemy's behind him. That's never good. He gets outflanked. He does it again at Brandywine. He misreads the ground. The enemy outflanks him. Again, they're behind him. So I think as a tactician, he has his moments, certainly, but he's definitely, second rate. He's got many, many other virtues, and they include a great eye for subordinate talent. He sees a 25-year-old Boston bookseller named Henry Knox, and somehow intuits this guy's going to be the father of American artillery. He's got a big brain organized for executive action. He'll take responsibility. He'll make decisions. He's really got an adhesive memory. He's articulate both orally and in writing. You rarely leave the commanding general's presence without knowing exactly what he wants you to do. And he's got the capacity, and he grows into it. And the capacity for growth is one of his most remarkable traits. He's got the capacity to inspire men to rally to his side for 8 years, as it turns out. He's very robust. He never seems to even catch cold for 8 years at a time when tens of thousands are dying of smallpox and typhus and typhoid and dysentery. So it's a mixed bag about his generalship, but he's operating largely on a higher plane, and that's where he becomes the father of our country.
You mentioned the word tactician. How about a strategist? Does he learn, in your opinion, from some of those tactical blunders early on in particular, especially in the New York campaign? Does he intuit or learn to be a better strategic thinker?
Yeah, I think he does, Jeff. He's inherently very aggressive. He wants one titanic battle to just solve the whole thing, and he's willing to go at it. And it's going to take him a while to recognize that he's battling a large professional army with lots of experienced officers, and they're supported by the greatest Navy the world has ever seen. He's basically got no Navy. And so he has to come to the recognition that he's got to fight on what today we would call the strategic defensive. meaning he'll pick his spots to nick and bleed the enemy. He's always trying to undermine British will, both at home in Britain and the will of the army. But he's going to play rope-a-dope, essentially. He's going to dance out of the way. He's rarely going to have a direct confrontation with that substantial British army, which includes 30,000 Hessian German mercenaries. And that is a pretty substantial alteration in the kind of war he thinks he's going to be fighting initially. It's why the war lasts 8 years, but it's also why he wins, because I think he's come very close to losing the whole ball game as he's retreating across New Jersey in late 1776. He writes his brother, "I think the game is pretty near up." And it's at that point that he's comes to the realization, I think, that he needs to be smarter about the strategy that he's going to employ. And he is the chief strategist. There is no Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's no Department of Defense. There's no Secretary of Defense. There's no president to guide him. He's the guy. And so he's got to grow into that.
So would you say he's chastened by his early mistakes and then adopts a strategy? I think he refers to it as fighting a war of posts, so kind of fighting retreats, we might say.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, he is going to look for his opportunities after that retreat across New Jersey, and he crosses into Pennsylvania out of desperation, and he is desperate. On Christmas night, 1776, famously, he crosses the Delaware eastbound back into New Jersey. He attacks the Hessian garrison at Trenton. He's got good intelligence about where they are and who they are, and destroys it. It's about 900 men there, and he obliterates that garrison. And then a week later, he does the same thing, which is really bold. He crosses the Delaware again. He baits the British into attacking him at Trenton, and in the night slips around their left flank and attacks the British rear garrison at Princeton and destroys that. And then he slips away again into North Jersey near Morristown, high ground where he can go into winter quarters and be safe. That's really well done tactically. Frederick the Great supposedly read about it, and Frederick the Great is no slouch. He read it with raised eyebrows and great admiration. So he's got his moments, there's no doubt about it, but he's going to have to learn that those moments where he can really stick it to the enemy are going to be few and far between.
So as a general, not so great. What about as a politician? Would you be willing to talk about that a little bit? Because it seems to me that the conventional wisdom about Washington, at least among sort of the lay reading public, is great general, not such a great politician who relies on younger, smarter men, Hamilton, Madison, to advise him. What is your view of Washington as a politician? And you mentioned he's got no president. The Congress has no executive officer. Yeah. He's kind of an executive in the political realm as much as the military during those years.
He is. I think that conventional wisdom, as you describe it, is actually completely wrong. I think that he's a so-so general. He ends up being a winning general, so we have to applaud him for that. But as a politician, I think in American military history, he has no equal. Maybe Dwight Eisenhower close to it. My friend Dave Petraeus would like to put himself in that pantheon too. But, Washington, right from the beginning, after he takes command of the Continental Army in Cambridge in July 1775, is at pains to write, eventually hundreds of letters to Congress, to state governors, to committees of safety. And he's doing a number of things in this correspondence. He's looking for help, he's looking for supplies, he's looking for men, he's making his case for the construction of the army that he's creating, basically. But the subtext is equally important. That subtext is, I am your servant. I acknowledge civilian control of the military. This is a very fraught subject in the 18th century. They all know who Cromwell is. And there's concern about Washington, who looks fantastic on a horse, turning against civilian leadership of the country. And he, throughout the Revolution, and of course subsequently through his presidency, embraces the notion of civilian control of the military. Politically, this is very, very astute because it helps him to get where he wants to go as a general. He develops allies very adroitly in Congress. So people like Henry Laurens, who's the second president of the Continental Congress succeeding John Hancock. Laurens had been the co-owner of the biggest slave trading entity in North America. He's gotten rich off of the slave trade. He's from Charleston, South Carolina. He's a real staunch ally of Washington's, and Washington's going to need him as an ally. He controls Congress to some extent. So, Washington's deft ability to relate to the civilian leadership, I think, is something that kind of sets the standard subsequently, and certainly passes down to us 250 years later, the rock-solid commitment that the military has to this day to civilian control.
Yes, and he's scrupulous about that during the entire war, and when his officers are egging him on to maybe march on Philadelphia or whatever and get their back pay, he always is steadfast in resisting that. But if we can fast forward a little bit to his presidency, the first term, when he rides at the head of an army to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, larger than any, as I understand it, any body of troops he commanded during the Revolution. Was that a mistake, do you think, or was that another instance of political deftness or cleverness? A lot of people at the time said, this is exactly that phalanx that we warned about, that the president, being commander-in-chief, can become the man on horseback, to use the phrase you mentioned.
I don't think it was a mistake, and I think in retrospect we can see that it's kind of a one-off, that he does what he thinks he needs to do. Did he really need to ride at the head of it? I don't know. George III essentially strapped on his sword to suppress the Gordon riots in 1780. This is a guy with no military experience, unlike virtually all of his predecessors as kings of England. The necessity of the moment required it, and I suppose that Washington felt the same way. I have trouble faulting him for that because I don't think that it anticipates. He's not looking at himself in the mirror and saying, I look pretty good, don't I, as commander-in-chief, and maybe I ought to do it more often, and maybe I should take a more active role in commanding the military. That's not where he is as a politician, as a man. He never goes there. So I think it's okay. I think he gets a pass on that in my book.
Mm-hmm. Jefferson heaps a little scorn on the whole thing, and by the time the army, he turns it over to Hamilton, as I recall. By the time the army gets there, the rebellion is pretty much melted away. But maybe an instance of his deftness is that he calls it the Army of the Constitution.
Yeah.
It's not bad.
Constitutionally, the notion that you've got a continental army, when it's hardly a continent, you've got a continental Congress. I mean, it's signal sending, right? And so he's very aware of how to do that.
Hardly an army, too.
He's down to 3,000 men in that winter of '76, and and he never has more than really 20,000. So it's, by modern standards, he's at the best of times he's got a couple of brigades. So.
Since you mentioned Eisenhower earlier, could we do a little comparison between Washington and Ike? You've written 3 volumes on World War II. And of course, Eisenhower is a major figure in that trilogy. Mm-hmm. How do you compare Washington and Eisenhower? Maybe superficially some differences, but what is your assessment of those two?
Yeah, I've had the privilege of living metaphorically with both of them for a long time. Eisenhower for almost 15 years, and now Washington for 12. They're completely different in their backgrounds, of course. Eisenhower, born in Texas, raised in a small town, Kansas. His father's kind of a failed merchant, basically. He goes to West Point, not because he wants to be Napoleon, but because it's free. Misses World War I as a combat officer. He's stuck at home. He and Omar Bradley both don't go. They were what we would call today clean sleeve. They don't have a combat patch.
Yeah, and finished with 5 stars, don't both of them? By the end of World War II?
Both of them end up with 5 stars. I mean, during World War II, Eisenhower ascends from lieutenant colonel to 5-star general in 46 months, something like that. It's a promotion every 6 months, basically. Their similarities as generals are, I think, pretty striking. And again, they both have big brains organized for executive action. Both are very articulate, both in writing and orally. Both have good eyes for subordinate talent. Both have the capacity to grow into the job. When Eisenhower shows up as a theater commander in the caves of Gibraltar just before the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, he has never heard a shot fired in anger. So he's got a long way to go, in the next couple of years, because he's going to be commanding millions in Europe. Washington has at least heard a lot of shots fired in anger in the French and Indian War, and yet, having been out of uniform for so long, he's got to grow into it too. And I think it's the capacity for growth that is really striking about both of them. So, I find, as men, they're both decent. They're both beloved is too strong for Washington because he's not warm and cuddly, but they're both ultimately respected and even revered by their subordinates. And they've got that in common. So there's a certain charisma that they both evince. When Washington comes into a room, he's almost 6'3", in an age when the average man is 5'6", 5'7". He dominates every room he's in. Eisenhower doesn't have the same physical stature. He's 5'10", and yet there is a command presence that he's got, and that's important. And so they both have that in common too. As superficial as it may be, it's important.
And both make the transition from military life to executive political life.
Yeah,
pretty well.
Yeah,
Washington protests that he's not well fitted for the job, but he turns out to be one of the 3 greatest presidents, probably, at least according to historians.
Mm-hmm.
Also, both become presidents of colleges.
Yeah, that's interesting too. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yes, yeah, right.
Ike at Columbia, Washington at William and Mary, as chancellor for a while.
It's lucky us, right, to have the right men in the right time in difficult moments, and that's one thing about American history over the past 250 years. We've been lucky that men have ascended, and someday women will fit that role too, I'm certain, when they're needed, and so those are 2 of the best examples of that.
Well, you're a military historian, and I think of the best sort, namely non-degreed, and you are further convincing me that some of the best history that's being written these days is by non-PhDs. The doctoral education seems to just train the creativity out of one. But you also, as with your training as a journalist, write with a lively and vivid style that apparently a lot of people enjoy reading. So as a military historian, you've switched now from one war to another.
Mm-hmm.
Any surprises in your research on the Revolution?
Oh, one of the pleasures of doing this, Jeff, is that I'm surprised every day. The mystery of the next unopened archival box is one of the things that gets me up in the morning. I spend a lot of time on the other side of the hill trying to understand what the enemy is doing, in this case, the British particularly. So I'm just gobsmacked by the Brits over and over, and have been since I started this project in 2013. Queen Elizabeth II opened up to outside scrutiny in early 2016 the Georgian papers as part of a project to digitize and catalog the papers of all 4 Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th century. She owned the papers. as the monarch. And I was among the first allowed in to take a look for a whole month, April 2016. And every day I would flash my badge at the Henry VIII gate to get into the castle in Windsor, where the papers are kept just west of London, and climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower, begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers. That's where they were kept in gorgeous, oversized red binders. Of the 500,000 pages in the Georgian papers, most of them are from the reign of George III, our last king, because he was king for almost 60 years, most of them previously unpublished. And so you really have a tactile sense of being in his presence. And it's there, and I spent a lot of time with those papers, and I've spent a lot of time with the Brits otherwise, at Kew, where the British National Archive is. I've been there for months collectively. And seeing what it is that he thinks he's doing and what it is his ministers think they're doing, what Parliament thinks it's doing, in waging war for 8 years against their own people across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail is, on the surface kind of mystifying. But when you dig deep enough, it has a certain coherence to it, even though it's predicated on certain erroneous strategic conceptions. For example, George believes, and the government believes, that Americans will be cowed by superior British firepower. That's wrong. George believes, the government believes, that there is a large residual silent majority of Americans who are loyalists. That's wrong. We know modern scholarship shows that of the 2 million white Americans in the colonies in 1775, maybe 20% were loyal to the crown. It's never enough to effect real opposition, particularly without enormous British support to the rebellion.
What about John Adams's quip that roughly thirds, a third loyalist, a third patriots, a third sort of fence sitters?
Yeah.
Do you accept that?
No, it's wrong. And he does it off the top of his head, and it's long after the Revolution where Adams makes that, he's asked, it's sort of, it's bad math. No, there are certainly fence sitters, and those three categories are fluid. You might be a fence sitter one day, but the British Army shows up in your backyard and you're waving your Union Jack, and they leave, and you're basically a rebel. So, but it's pretty clear that about 1 in 5 are loyalists, committed loyalists. And that's just not enough. And the loyalists lack national leaders. They lack effective propaganda. They lack the ability to sustain themselves without massive British support. Even though there are pockets of loyalism along the western frontier from New York down through the Carolinas and in parts of the maritime mid-Atlantic states and the eastern shore of Maryland and Delaware, those are loyalist pockets, New York City. But it's just not enough. And so I think that one of the things that the rebels, the patriots, have going for them is that both they have numbers, and they do have national leaders, and they do have extraordinarily effective propaganda. So the loyalists cannot match that.
Well, since we're on quotations, and you had that marvelous chance to look at the Georgian papers, may I ask, there are 2 quotations attributed to George III, and I've always been curious about them. One is that when word got back to George III that Washington was planning to step down and resign, he said words to the effect that if he does that, he'll be the greatest man of the age.
Yeah.
Do you believe he said that?
I think he did. I think I think it's Benjamin West. You can't quote me on this because I'm not there yet in my research. I think it's Benjamin West who...
The portrait painter.
Yeah.
Yes.
He becomes the court painter for George. And so he's around him a fair amount. He's doing these big historical portraits that George really loves. And he quotes George on a couple of occasions in ways that I think ring true historically. You got to wait till I get there, though, before I can be absolutely committed to that.
All right. The other one is that George III, referred to the entire revolution as a Presbyterian rebellion, merely a Presbyterian rebellion. Have you ever come across that?
I don't think I have. It sounds like him, actually. I don't think I have heard that. You know, he's so committed to suppressing the rebellion, for reasons we can talk about if you want, that he draws up an abdication. It's in those papers in Windsor Castle. This is late in the war, and he's going to put aside his crown if his government, if Parliament doesn't adhere to his rigorous effort to suppress the insurrection.
What's fascinating, so please dilate on that a little bit for us.
Well, he believes, this is another strategic misconception, and it's shared by his government, and it's shared by majorities in both the House of Lords and the House of Commons. He believes that if the American insurrection is permitted to succeed and the Americans break away from the British Empire, it will encourage insurrections in Canada, in Ireland, in the rich sugar islands of the West Indies, where the real money is, in India, and it'll be the beginning of the end of the first British Empire, which has been created by Britain's overwhelming victory in the 7 Years' War and the peace of 1763, which has given them Canada, it's given them 500 million fertile acres west of the Appalachians. It's made them the dominant trading power in the world. They have a merchant fleet of 8,000 ships. They have the greatest navy the world has ever seen, and George isn't going to let that slip away. It's happened on his watch because he becomes king in 1760, and he's not going to let that British Empire slip away, and he just believes that the American rebellion is a slippery slope. John Adams, after the revolution ends, arrives in London as our first minister to the court of St. James, our first ambassador, and he has an audience with George. And George says to Adams, "I was the last to give it up." And that's true. He's really the last to give it up. And it gives you some idea of the mindset that he's got. He's got many admirable traits. The American stereotype of him, Jefferson calls him a tyrant in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine calls him a royal brute in Common Sense, published in January 1776. Every night, the sinister ninny prances across the stage of Hamilton singing, "You'll be back." That's not who George is. He's a constitutional monarch. He's a patriot king. He's a child of the Enlightenment. He's deeply committed to the arts and the sciences. He's not crazy.
He did not go mad.
He did not go mad during the Revolution.
During the Regency?
During he has episodes that we now know, chemical imbalances. It was thought for a while that he had a blood disease, and that's now been debunked. Blood disease that can cause hallucinations and so on. In 1788, I think, was the first time he really had an episode that lasted several months. He was in a straitjacket for a while. He's kind of bonkers. And it goes away. And it goes away in time for him to be monarch during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, which is good for Britain. It comes back again, I think, in 1804. Same thing, lasts several months, and then it goes away. And of course, the doctors are clueless. They're bleeding him, they're blistering him, the treatments are medieval. And then in 1810, it strikes again, and it never goes away. And the last 10 years of his life are absolutely miserable. He spends the last decade at Windsor, essentially in a cell. And the Queen, it's a loving marriage, 15 kids. The Queen sees him for the last time for 15 minutes in 1812 and never sees him again. He grows a long white beard, long white hair. He goes blind, he goes deaf. He sits there playing the harpsichord that he can't hear. It's really awful. It's a tragic arc to his life. But it has nothing to do with the revolution. He's perfectly robust during the Revolution. He goes horseback riding almost every morning. He eats really well. He's a good husband, which is not a given for 18th century monarchs. So there's a lot to like about him, but he is, stubborn to a fault.
Well, since you raised it, may I ask your personal view? The language of tyrant in the Declaration of Independence, do you think that's hyperbolic? There were a couple of congressmen who objected to it. One of them was John Adams. So do you think it's hyperbolic?
I think a lot of the Declaration of Independence is hyperbolic. My friend Andrew Roberts, who wrote a very good biography of George III. Andrew's a wonderful writer and biographer. I don't think he quite understands the American Revolution because he's a Tory at heart. But his biography of George is good, and he points out, I think quite rightly, that the bill of indictments that is assembled is, kind of ridiculous in many cases. Okay, it's a propaganda instrument with magnificent language in the front end of it. He's got tyrannical moments, there's no doubt about that, when he basically 6 armed regiments on his own people. That's an act of tyranny. He doesn't, part of the problem is George never leaves southern England in his long life. He never visits Scotland, much less North America.
Never saw the sea until he was middle-aged, something, right?
Which is remarkable, isn't it? And he's worldly because he's a good reader. There's 65,000 volumes in his personal library, the basis for the British Library, one of the great libraries in the history of libraries. And he studies and he reads about North America, but he's never been here, and virtually no one in his cabinet has ever been here. They don't understand what's happening in America. They have no real comprehension. They're being informed by loyalists who have a vested interest in persuading the crown to do whatever it takes to keep those loyalists in power. I think that is the basis for a lot of the misconceptions that he's got, and one of the reasons that he is so stubborn. He just doesn't have a feel for that portion of his empire.
We can be excused for that. I mean, a number of Europeans have crazy ideas. Buffon says that all the animals are stunted here on this continent, and men and so forth.
Yeah, right.
Washington, maybe 6'4", actually, at his prime. Jefferson, 6'2½".
Yeah.
So he could be forgiven for that, I suppose.
That's right. The descriptions, and the Hessians show up, and their descriptions of America, and they're actually here, and their descriptions of flora and fauna that is so spectacularly wrong. You just wonder, what are you seeing? So,
well, you've taken us through some fascinating details. So can I ask you to, let's raise the lens a little bit. Maybe let's go up 30,000 feet or so. And this book focuses on really the first 2.5 years, beginning with Lexington and Concord's 1775. Could you give us kind of that 30,000-foot view? What's going on in those early years of the Revolution?
Yeah. Well, there's been a 10-year run-up to Lexington and Concord, which is April 19th, 1775, and the grievances build up. The efforts by Britain to appease the colonists, particularly in Massachusetts and the other New England colonies, and they fall short. Stamp Act is adopted. The British are deeply in debt as a consequence of the war they have fought, the 7 Years' War, and they're looking to recoup a little bit of money from us, from the Americans. The level of taxation is minuscule. The average American is paying in taxes about 1/50th of what his counterpart in Britain is paying. But the average American has no voice in that level of taxation. I live in the District of Columbia. My license plate says taxation without representation. And it pisses me off, and it pissed them off to the point where they were rebellious about it. So the war begins with the British deciding, the orders come from London, telling General Gage in Boston, you will take action. He puts together a column of about 1,000 men. They march out of Boston tiptoeing in the middle of the night, thinking nobody will notice. Of course, everyone in Massachusetts knows about it immediately. They run into some, fewer than 100 men on Lexington Common. First shot is fired. No one knows who fired it. Within several minutes, there are 8 Americans dead, 10 Americans wounded. They march on to Concord, and Concord is ready for them. So the gunplay is significant on that first day. The British are chased back to Boston, harassed all the way. It's about 18 miles from Concord to Boston. And that first day of the war ends, and there are bodies all the way from Concord to Boston, bodies of men, bodies of horses, bodies of livestock of all sorts. And, once that genie's out of the bottle, it's hard to put it back in. 2 months later at Bunker Hill, the British are going to recapture about a square mile of rebel-held territory just across the Charles River from Boston. At a cost of 1,000 British casualties, 226 British dead. It's getting pretty awful pretty quickly. And so the war is going to unspool with the British eventually evacuating Boston. Henry Knox, that 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller, is sent by Washington to retrieve some cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. In the middle of the winter, and he brings them back on sleds across the snow. Says, "Boss, I'm here. I got 50 cannons out here for you," and that's exactly what they need to put it on the high ground and force the British to evacuate Boston in the middle of March, 1776. So the war then moves to New York. The Americans under Washington's command are fortifying Manhattan and the areas around Brooklyn, Staten Island. The British show up with a very large force, including an enormous fleet. And Washington is outgeneraled at the Battle of Long Island in August 1776. He escapes by the skin of his teeth after being outflanked and having his whole force pushed back into Brooklyn. And in the middle of the night, East River fog, Washington has assembled enough boats to slip across the East River back to Manhattan and get away. It's really close. But the British are right behind him, and they're going to land at Kips Bay, and they're going to take over lower Manhattan, where New York City is at that time. And they're eventually going to rout the garrison, again, bad generalship by Washington, Fort Washington, north of Harlem. He thinks it's impregnable. It's very steep. It's one of the highest points on Manhattan Island. 3,000 American soldiers there. It falls in about an hour and a half. And those 3,000 Americans are captured. So they're driven completely out of New York, and they retreat across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. And that's where, out of desperation, he concocts his plan to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton. And there we are at the end of 2 years. They go into winter quarters. In those days, fighting was pretty minimal in the winter. And so for 5 months, not much happens. And that's where the book ends.
What percentage of his troops did he lose in the New York campaign? I've heard as high as 90%. Is that accurate?
No, I don't think that's right. I mean, the Army expands and contracts constantly. So, he's got as many as 20,000 at one point. When he's retreating across New Jersey, it's 3,000, but when he's in Pennsylvania, it builds back up. Part of it is that militia units join. They're part-time soldiers. He's very disdainful of the militia, but then he grudgingly comes to recognize that they're useful for various things, and they are really useful. Sickness kills way more than bullets do. Smallpox, typhus historically the great killer of armies, smallpox, the king of terrors. Washington makes the decision, again, this is a tribute to his generalship and his capacity for growth, having forbidden the Army to be inoculated. It's a crude form of vaccination, but it's pretty effective against smallpox, but you got to isolate the men because they're very infectious for weeks. And he has said no initially. The Army invades Canada. One of the things that happens in that first couple of years, we decide we're going to try and force the Canadians to be the 14th colony. This is the semi-quincentennial of our invasion of Canada. It goes very badly. And that army is driven out of Canada, and it is infested with smallpox. And it's a terrible disease. It's a terrible way to die. So Washington makes the decision, listening to his medical officers, including men like Benjamin Rush, one of the fathers of American medicine, and he orders the army to be inoculated. This is in the winter of early '77. It's a heroic decision, and it's absolutely critical to the future success of the Army, because when smallpox gets into men living in close quarters, it can destroy that unit, that force. We see him making decisions predicated on careful analysis, listening to his subordinates, the ones he trusts most. That's one of the most important decisions that he makes in the first couple of years of the war.
And we're back to your earlier observation, his capacity for growth and to learn.
Yeah.
Well, one more question, maybe? All right. Since we talked about 30,000 feet a few minutes ago, in this age of stealth aircraft and hypersonic missiles and so forth, seems like a long, long time ago, another world.
Yeah.
What lessons can we learn from the revolution today, in your view?
Yeah. It is another world 250 years ago, and it's a different kind of warfare. It's very intimate, killing is, because the musket's mostly inaccurate beyond 80 yards, so a lot of the killing is with bayonets, so it's eyeball to eyeball. We can learn a lot of things, I think, and it's one of the reasons to read history. It's one of the reasons to read about the American Revolution. We can see that whatever difficulties are plaguing us in 2025, where partisan rancor seems to grow ever more venomous, we've overcome bigger perils in the past, existential perils, including trying to win our independence. And you can go through 250 years of American history, including Civil War, Great Depression, 2 world wars, and so on. And that should be, I think, reassuring to us that we've got the ability as a people, now almost 340 million strong, to overcome these momentous obstacles in our way. So that's one thing. We're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that generation of founders. It includes personal liberties. It includes strictures on how to divide power and to keep it from concentrating in the hands of authoritarians who think primarily themselves. We can't let that slip away. We can't let that be taken away. We can't be oblivious to priceless gift, or the hundreds of thousands who've given their lives to affirm and sustain it over the past 250 years. So there are many things to, I think, be drawn from our collective national history. And things to be proud of, things to cringe at. Slavery, for example. Washington, in his lifetime at Mount Vernon, owned at least 577 slaves. You can't square that circle morally. And Jefferson had even more. So, but we take it within the context of the time, we take it within the context of their enormous achievements. And I think that's part of what historians should do, is to balance it and to present it within the context of the time, and to not condemn them for not being perfect. They're not marble men. They're much more interesting than that. And that's one of the reasons to read history, too.
Well, in this book, The British Are Coming, you've given us a fascinating portrait of those early years of the American Revolution, the first of your planned 3 books on the Revolution. And Rick Atkinson, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for the conversation.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.